At a certain point in today's story, you're going to hear what sounds like the end of the story, like the final reveal, except it's not. There's a whole another layer to this story if you just stick around, and it is completely insane. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1962, a middle-aged woman named Angelina Narcisse walked into a hospital room inside the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer, which is a medical center in central Haiti. Inside, Angelina saw one of her brothers, 40-year-old Clairvius, propped up in the hospital bed. He had an IV sticking out of one arm, and he had an oxygen mask strapped over his face. His eyes were closed. And when Angelina touched his hand and said hello, he didn't react. Angelina had just been briefed by Clairvius's doctors about what was going on here. She knew that 2 days earlier, her brother had come to the hospital coughing up blood and running a dangerously high fever. Doctors had managed to get his fever down, but they determined that his blood pressure was dangerously high and he also had fluid accumulating in his lungs. But they didn't know why any of that was happening or how to control it or stop it. So now, less than 48 hours after Clairvius's symptoms began, he was barely conscious. For Angelina, it was obviously very scary to see her brother so sick like this. But it was also confusing, because she knew that one of her other brothers had seen Clairvius just a few hours before he had shown up at the hospital with these horrible symptoms. And Clairvius at the time had seemed completely fine. This illness seemed to have come out of nowhere. But as Angelina looked around the hospital room, she also found herself feeling pretty annoyed, because she had 4 other siblings, 2 more brothers and 2 sisters, and none of them were here. Now, Angelina knew she shouldn't be surprised. Ever since their parents had died, there had been basically non-stop drama between all the siblings, and most of the drama centered around Clairvius himself. When their parents had passed away, Clairvius was the one who had ultimately inherited their money and land. And so these days he was sort of living like a king. He lived in one of the nicest places in their village and was constantly flaunting his wealth. Meanwhile, Angelina and her other siblings really struggled financially. And anytime they asked Clairvius for help, he refused, which had caused a huge rift in the family. So Angelina was now the only one who'd even shown up to visit him in the hospital, despite his condition being so dire. Nonetheless, she sat down on a plastic chair inside the room, and for a few minutes, she just watched Clairvius breathing. For a while, his breathing seemed normal. It was rhythmic, slow, but normal. But then, suddenly, Clairvius's breath seemed to almost catch in his chest, and then he began making a sort of wheezing, gurgling sound, but he was half-conscious, so it was like his body was reacting to not being able to breathe. Angelina instinctively just stood up, grabbed her brother's hand, and began to squeeze it. And as she did, she saw her brother's eyelids flutter open for a second, but then his eyelids closed. She watched as underneath his eyelids she could see his eyes darting around all over the place, and at the same time the wheezing sound that was coming out of her brother turned into a choking noise. Angelina let go of her brother's hand. She ran into the hallway and found a doctor. But unfortunately, by the time she explained what was going on and she and this doctor returned to the hospital room, they found Clairvius no longer making any noise. He was totally still. The doctor rushed over to him and checked for a pulse, but he couldn't find one. He turned to Angelina and said, "I'm sorry, but your brother is dead." The following morning, May 3rd, Angelina arrived at the small cemetery near their village for her brother's funeral. She was glad to see that at least this time her 4 remaining siblings had decided to show up. But at the same time, Angelina was in shock. She couldn't believe what had happened. The doctors had told her that ultimately Clairvius had died from something called malignant hypertension, which is basically blood pressure that's so high it causes organ damage. It also causes pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs that can ultimately make it impossible to breathe, which very likely was what that choking sound was before he died. But the doctors told Angelina that despite knowing what actually happened to Clairvius, they didn't know why it happened. It was totally unclear how he got these symptoms in the first place, and unfortunately for Angelina and their family, it seemed pretty unlikely that they would ever figure it out. It would just be this mystery. As Angelina walked up to Clairvius's gravesite, she looked down and saw her brother lying dead inside of his open casket. She reached out and touched his hand one last time. It was so cold that Angelina pulled it away right away, and then she began to cry. The ceremony was a blur for Angelina. The whole thing just felt surreal. But eventually it wrapped up, and Angelina and her other siblings were walking up to the casket to say their final goodbyes to their brother. They stepped back and watched as cemetery employees closed Clairvius's casket and lowered it into the ground. However, after Angelina and her family had all returned to their homes and were beginning to grieve the loss of their brother, something else began to happen at that cemetery. That same night, a little after midnight, 2 men conspicuously entered the small cemetery carrying shovels. As they walked, they kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching them. They went up to Clairvius's very fresh grave, and with their shovels, they dug and dug until finally they revealed his casket. They pulled his casket out of the ground. They pried the nails off the top. They flipped it open. They pulled his body out and laid it on the ground next to the hole. Then, as fast as they could, they closed the casket back up and reburied it. They put all the dirt back, all the grass back, making it look like nobody had touched it. After that was done, they walked over to Clairvius's body and tied his wrists and ankles together with rope. Then they wrapped Clairvius's body in a large black cloth. Together, they hoisted his body up, placed him on their respective shoulders, and carried him out of the cemetery, off into the wilderness on the outskirts of the village. When the sun began to rise, they stopped and found a good spot to hide with Clairvius's body in the trees. When the sun went back down again, the 2 men were up and on the move. They did this for days until finally they reached a massive, fenced-in plot of land in northern Haiti. When they got there, it was just starting to get light outside. With the dawn, they could see dozens and dozens of people moving through this vast field in front of them. And all these people were moving in a sort of jerky, unnatural way. All of them were holding machetes. But these 2 men who had lugged Clairvius's body here were not afraid. They unlocked the fence and carried Clairvius's body right up a pathway through the middle of this field, past all these people. As they passed by these machete-wielding workers, they didn't even seem to notice the men or the body. It was like this was totally normal. Eventually, the men reached the middle of this field where there was a building, and the men went inside. The interior of this building was basically one large room with a table in the center and a bunch of shelves that lined the walls. The shelves were stacked with glass containers that had things in them like dried plants, some taxidermy animals, and what appeared to be human bones. Standing in the middle of this room was these 2 men's boss. He was a very old man, and he had this very expectant look on his face. Without saying a word, the 2 men placed Clairvius's body on the table in the center of the room and unwrapped the black cloth around him. Their boss looked very carefully at Clairvius's face. Then he smiled and handed each of the men a stack of money. 18 years later, February 1980, Clairvius's sister Angelina walked through an outdoor market in her small village in central Haiti. By this point, it had been almost 2 decades since Clairvius had died, and Angelina didn't really think about him that much anymore. But on this particular day, as she was shopping, an old man approached her. He was very thin, his face was very sunken, and he had this long, deep scar on his cheek that went from the side of his mouth to his ear. His eyes were bloodshot and wide like he was sort of wild, and in this gravelly voice he told her that his name was Clairvius, and that he was her brother. But when Angelina saw this guy and heard this, she did not think this was her brother. She thought, this man is obviously out of his mind, or he's lying, or both. But this is clearly not my brother Clairvius. He's dead. On top of that, in addition to all the discrepancies she was immediately clocking, this man did not remotely look like her brother did. He looked completely different. In particular, there was this big scar on his face that she certainly didn't remember on Clairvius's face. So Angelina told this man, "No, you are not my brother, and you need to leave me alone." But the man, when he heard this, sort of freaked out. He grabbed Angelina's shoulders and started violently shaking her, insisting that no, he really was Clairvius. Angelina screamed, and the next thing she knew, she was surrounded by a crowd of very confused, worried onlookers. Then a police officer walked over, grabbed the man, and dragged him away. Later that same day, a police officer sat in an interview room at the police station across from this older man who kept insisting he was Clairvius. And the story that this man told the officer about how he could be a man who had died 18 years earlier was absolutely insane. because this man claimed that 18 years earlier, when he died, he remembered that exact moment because he heard the doctor literally pronounce him dead, and he heard his siblings start to cry. He remembered the cold when the hospital staff moved him to the refrigerated morgue. He remembered the sound of them nailing his coffin shut, and he remembered what it felt like when one of those nails punctured through and cut his cheek. That's how he got that big scar on his face. It was a nail in his coffin going right through his face. Basically, he wasn't dead. He was totally mentally conscious of everything happening to him. He just physically couldn't move or react in any way. He didn't know why, but everybody thought he was dead, and he wasn't. He said later that same night, as he's literally in a coffin underground waiting to suffocate to death, he became aware of two men suddenly unearthing him and removing him from his coffin. They tied him up, wrapped him in cloth, and carried him into the wilderness for days. Finally, they entered a building in the middle of a field and set him down on a table. He heard a third man thank the men that had carried him. Then, this third man poured something into Clairvius's mouth and started chanting over and over again. A few minutes later, Clairvius found his body was beginning to work again. He could open his eyes. He could sort of move his limbs. Suddenly, his vision was very strange and hazy. His body movements were jerky and uncoordinated. It almost felt like his mind was moving slower than it was supposed to, like it was just dumbed down. And it was at that point that Clairvius realized what was actually going on here. He said this old man that had poured the liquid in his mouth and was chanting was a Bokor, a voodoo priest in Haiti. The Bokor had used a potion to turn Clairvius into a zombie. Clairvius told the police officer that he'd been absolutely terrified. He wanted to fight back, but his body felt like jello, and he could barely form a coherent thought. There was no way he could actually do anything. He said the Bokor untied him, made him stand up, and marched him outside. Everything looked blurry, but he could tell he was in the middle of a huge sugarcane field. He saw at least a dozen other people moving in the same awkward, jerky way that he knew he was, harvesting the sugarcane with machetes. The Bokor handed Clairvius a machete and told him to get out there, join them, and get to work. Something deep in Clairvius's mind told him to use the machete to attack the Bokor so he could escape, but he didn't. Instead, he just walked out into the field and started working. He kept working day in and day out in this bizarre zombie-like state for 2 full years. Then one day, another one of these zombies finally did attack and kill the Bokor. Suddenly, all the zombies were free. But the man saying he was Clairvius did not go straight home. He couldn't, because he knew this Bokor had not randomly targeted him. The Bokor had been hired to turn Clairvius into a zombie, and in his mind, there was only one person who would have hired the Bokor to do that, and that person was still alive, back home in his village. If he returned, they would very likely just kill him. So he spent 16 years just wandering around northern Haiti, working random odd jobs, barely surviving, but he kept up with news from his village. And when he saw that the person who he believed had hired the Bokor had finally died, he felt safe enough to go back home. Now, after hearing this story, the police officer did not immediately think, boy, this is legitimate, this must have happened. Instead, he thought this sounded completely insane. But just in case, he went to Clairvius's siblings and asked them to give him a list of questions that only the real Clairvius could answer. Super specific information from their childhood. When the officer came back and began asking this man the questions, the man claiming to be Clairvius answered all of them correctly. This really was Clairvius. The news of Clairvius's return from the dead quickly spread all across the globe. For the most part, when people outside of Haiti read or heard about it, they assumed the story was just folklore or some kind of hoax. But in 1982, 20 years after Clairvius supposedly died and 2 years after he supposedly came back to life, a Harvard University researcher named Wade Davis traveled to Haiti to investigate the story. And what he found was that Clairvius was definitely telling the truth. Here's what many scientists and Clairvius's family believe really happened to him on the morning of April 30th, 1962. That morning, he woke up feeling perfectly fine. He was completely healthy, just like his sister Angelina had thought. He just wanted to put the whole family drama about the inheritance behind them. And then he gave Clairvius a hug. But what Clairvius did not know at the time was that during this hug, his brother intentionally rubbed a fine powder onto his skin. This powder did make Clairvius incredibly sick, but it was not designed to kill him. Instead, it completely paralyzed him. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, his eyes, nothing. and it lowered his heart rate so low that doctors thought Clairvius was dead, which is exactly what his brother and the Bokor he conspired with had planned for. They knew he would be determined dead. He would be buried really quickly. And then, right after he was buried, the Bokor sent those two men to dig Clairvius up while he was still paralyzed. They carried him off to that sugarcane plantation where he became a slave, given drugs every day and forced to work non-stop. For Clairvius's brother, the reason he did this was to punish Clairvius for being so selfish with the money he inherited from their parents. This was the plan, to turn him into a zombie slave. It would turn out the active ingredient in the paralyzing powder that the brother rubbed on Clairvius was tetrodotoxin, which is a potent poison found in pufferfish. And the active ingredient in the liquid that the Bokor gave Clairvius to keep him in line was called the zombie's cucumber, a hallucinogenic plant native to Haiti. After returning to his village and telling his story to the world, Clairvius actually would go on to live a relatively normal life. He lived with his siblings until he died in 1994 at the age of 72. Even though he was able to clearly articulate who did this to him, both his brother and the Bokor were dead by the time he returned to tell the tale. Nobody was ever held to account for any of it.